With the recent release of Heretic, we've been thinking back on all our favorite A24 horror movies. I'm Meg from Strangely Awesome, and here are our picks for the top 5 best scary movies released by the studio. Coming in at number 5 is one we consider to be an underrated pick. This is Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. While much of the later entries on this list fall into the quote-unquote elevated horror camp, Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is a straightforward, silly slasher. That being said, Bodies, Bodies, Bodies has a lot to love. The movie takes place in a mansion where a group of 20-somethings are going for a weekend retreat. In the evening, they start playing one of their favorite games. It's basically a cross between Mafia and Among Us, where one player is the killer and sneaks around the house and eliminates the others by tapping them on the back. When the bodies are discovered, everyone gathers around to discuss who they think did it. Since this is a horror movie, it turns out someone is actually killing others. What ensues is a tense yet hilarious whodunit, where a bunch of Gen Zers and millennials accuse each other of being the killer. Within this setup, there's some great humor which lovingly pokes fun at younger generations, and some social commentary which is poignant and funny. Bodies, Bodies, Bodies has only gotten better in the few years it's aged, with several members of the cast rising to superstardom. Seeing comedians Rachel Sennett, Pete Davidson, and the acolytes Amandla Stenberg and Maria Baklova from The Apprentice all in one confined place is kind of great. Bodies, Bodies, Bodies also has a great theme from Charlie XCX. So if you're missing Brat Summer, you've got to give it a watch. Our next pick is a massive departure in tone. Coming in at our number 4 spot is The Lighthouse. The film stars Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson opposite each other as two isolated lighthouse keepers in the late 19th century. Throughout the film, the two are driven to madness by their isolation and the mysterious forces at play in this remote New England island. The actions and dialogue that depicts their descent varies from disturbing to delightfully funny. While the dialogue and performances are great, The Lighthouse is also such a visually interesting film. It is shot in a nearly square aspect ratio in stark black and white, which leads to some really interesting framing and lighting, which helps The Lighthouse transport viewers back to a more isolated time. To bring us into the top 3, we're going with Midsommar. This movie is an absolute phenomenon, and for great reason. Midsommar doesn't rely on the typical tropes horror movies use to unsettle viewers. It doesn't hide in the dark or use cheap jump scares. Instead, the movie takes place in a festival in Sweden where the days are extremely long, and it's going to show you some really shocking imagery in broad daylight. It's one of those films that disturbs for sure, but we just can't look away. Midsommar has reached downright iconic status thanks to an excellent performance from a young Florence Pugh, who really gives it her all as she goes from being skeptical to terrified to being idolized by this cult. Now, before we get into our runner-up pick, we want to take a moment to remind you that Strangely Awesome is an independently owned small business where we cover movies, TV shows, and video games. If you like what we do and want to support us, the good news is you already are by watching our videos. If you want to keep up with what we do, subscribe here on YouTube and check out our website at strangelyawesomegames.com. Now, if you really love what we do and want to go the extra mile to support us, joining us as a channel member or sending us YouTube super chats would mean the world to us and our team. Now, back to the video. We knew we had to pick one of the movies from Ty West's Incredible X trilogy to be on this list, but it was a tough choice. Ultimately, we gotta give it to Pearl. Pearl was the surprise follow-up to X, which again stars Mia Goth as Pearl. She's a young farm girl who's starting to go mad as the isolation of her life gets to her as her husband is away to fight in the First World War. Throughout the movie, Pearl becomes obsessed with the idea of fame and superstardom. She's willing to get there at any cost, including by eliminating people in her life whom she perceives to be tying her down and keeping her from achieving her dreams. Pearl is a really great character piece, playing out as part psychological drama and part slasher. But of course, from the perspective of the killer. We won't spoil the twists and turns here, but just know Pearl has some really adult themes, and Mia Goth's character continually finds us cringing as her motivation for a better life leads her to become a disturbingly destructive force. And yet, the performance is so good and oddly charming that I kind of want her to succeed. Pearl is an undeniable instant classic with a huge cult following, which has arguably defined horror in the 2020s. So what could top it? Hereditary. Not only is Hereditary the best of A24's horror movies, but it is one of the best films in the genre point blank period. It seems to have set a new standard, as even some of our favorite horror movies, like Longlegs, clearly copies its homework. While this can sometimes be a detriment to movies which often find themselves homaged, Hereditary is inventive enough to not suffer from this problem. Hereditary follows a family after the loss of their matriarch, making discoveries about her sinister past as they seek to process their grief. It becomes apparent that this family is cursed, and throughout the film they're punished for it in some truly haunting ways. The core of the film is centered on Toni Collette's character of Annie Graham. She is unraveling at the seams as she processes the death of her mother, which leads her to make some shocking discoveries. Hereditary has elements from all sorts of horror genres, which make for a unique blend. It's quite the psychological horror of the greats, like The Shining, some really nasty gore and practical effects, and some truly sinister supernatural elements. If you haven't seen it and are a horror fan, Hereditary is a must-watch. So, what do you think of our picks? Do you agree or disagree? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more on A24 Horror Movies, check out our review on Heretic.